Yeah. So, look, before I get underway, let me do some introductions. You probably have them in front of you anyway, but let me just follow the order. I'm Quentin Grafton. I'm the Chief Economist at the Bureau of Resources and Energy Economics. It's my pleasure to facilitate this session on productivity, a matter of particular interest to myself and our Bureau and my department. And I'd like to go through the order. So over to you, to Robin Shreeve at the Australian Workforce and Productivity Agency. And then Jenny Gordon at the Productivity Commission. Most appropriate to have the PC here. Then Bob Breunig, a professor at the Crawford School at the Australian National University. And of course, you know Stephen Kennedy, Deputy Secretary at DISRA. So that's the panel. We're going to have plenty of time for questions. In fact, we look forward to the questions engaging with us. But I think it's appropriate to at least have the panel speakers here in front of us have a word or two of introduction about maybe a couple of issues that they want to bring forth right now, and then we can get into a more general discussion. So if we can just sort of follow the order that I did in terms of the introduction. So Robin, over to you first, please.
Well, thanks very much. We've just released our new National Workforce Development Strategy. And in doing that, we modelled 4 different scenarios because we're aware of all the dangers of linear forecasting. And 3 of the 4 models projected that we'll need to increase skills by about 3% per annum, skills and qualifications in the tertiary sector, in order to meet industry demand. We modelled what industry structure was going to look like, and from that we could get qualification structure. And obviously that helps us to avoid skill shortages, but all the research that we did will show that that has a positive impact on participation and productivity. And one of my colleagues who's in the audience, Matthew Bowd, has just done a major literature review in terms of the impact of skills qualifications on productivity at both the firm, the individual and the national level. And you know, most of the research is saying that it's very positive. But one of the issues is that most of the research says it's very positive, but I suppose we would argue it's a necessary but not a sufficient condition. Because you too get examples, for example, Scotland, which has got a higher level of qualification than England, but they don't do so well economically, and you've got cases of places like Egypt. So one of the other things that we're interested in is the whole question of skills utilisation and how firms actually increase productivity within the black box of the firm. I mean, we've got correlations where you take wages as a substitute for productivity, and we know the higher qualified you are, the more wages you get, therefore there's an increase in productivity. But I think it's interesting because productivity happens at the firm level. And one of the things that AWPA's been engaged with is looking at skills utilisation, and we've done studies of different companies and we've got a lot more work to do. But one of the anecdotes I might share with you that stood out is that one of the companies we actually looked at was the RSPCA in Victoria. And they had a major issue when they had a new CEO, or she identified 2 major issues. One, that everybody expected all the money they got in to be spent on the animals, quite rightly, and the other thing was that they had a major issue in terms of workers' compensation claims, about $800,000 a year. So what she did was actually spend more money on skills and put a new organisational structure in. She actually got senior animal attendants and defined jobs and defined the organisational structure. And what that meant was that people were not only happier, but their workers' compensation bill came down from about $800,000 a year to $200,000 a year, which is, you know, obviously in terms of the output, a lot more positive. So I do think that there's a correlation between the development of skills, whether it's formally or informally, productivity and participation. But I think what we're particularly interested in is taking the debate forward about how skills are utilised in the workforce, how skills are utilised in the firm, and what we can do positively to actually increase that. It also raises an issue of what is the role of government in doing this within the firm. Because people could say, well, you know, it's up to me, it's up to my firm how we organise ourselves. And it's quite interesting looking at the interventions that happen in other countries. Clearly we know in more managed economies like Germany, where, you know, skills are often organised by the Chamber of Commerce, and you have to be a member of the Chamber of Commerce to do that. But in the UK, for example, there's an intervention called Investors in People, where people have to implement skills utilisation policies, and the Investors in People is a kite mark, and you often can't get a government contract unless you've got that kite mark. So in terms of taking the debate forward, I mean, it's teasing out the correlation, having a look at human capital and the theoretical aspects, but also having a look about the utilisation of skills. One interesting facet about this is that a number of people have said to us that HR management in Australia has been far too concerned with industrial relations and grievances and not enough about organisational development, which will have a greater impact on productivity. And that is a hangover from the centralised wage fixing arrangements where HR managers were basically employed not to talk about the design of the organisation and increasing productivity, but to actually say to the CEO what you could and couldn't do within an award-based structure. So they're the types of issues that we're interested in, both from the theoretical and practical level.
Thanks so much, Robert. It fits in as well with Steve's presentation.
Well, thank you very much. I think there's a couple of points probably that the Commission likes to make occasionally anyway. One is that productivity growth is important, but it's not everything. So productivity growth doesn't guarantee an increase in well-being. It increases output. It's about the efficiency at which we convert inputs to outputs. Now, if we get improvements in the quality of output that increase people's well-being, but we don't measure those increases in the quality of output, then we actually might be having a lower productivity growth number, but actually be doing better because what's being delivered improves the well-being of the people in the community. So we need to worry about whether we're, what we're actually measuring. And I think the other bit of that obviously is Quentin put up the terms of trade shock, which gave us a massive increase in income, but not from our own productivity, but through the fact that we got lucky that what we produce the rest of the world wants, and so the prices of it went up. So there's a number of different sources of increases in well-being, and that ultimately is what the government is after. So productivity growth is a means to an end. Increasing the output that we can produce from our inputs is a means to an end, but not an end in of itself. But I think it's important to think about then, what do we measure when we measure productivity growth? Productivity growth is a residual, right? So we define it as the bits of output growth that we can't explain by input growth. Right? So the one thing it's never is an increase in the hours worked, because that in labour productivity is the one thing we can measure. Right? So in multi-factor productivity growth, we try and account for the growth in capital and the growth in labour. But we may not account very well for a growth in the quality of labour or the quality of the capital. So productivity growth often picks up improvements in those qualities, which is a really useful thing. Right? But they still take investments to achieve. And then you take the definition on inputs further and you think about natural resource inputs. And again, Quentin's discussion of mining, and Stephen mentioned it as well, that a lot of concern is about with natural resource inputs is depletion effects. As you keep mining deposits or the prices go up and you mine more marginal deposits, your actual natural resource input quality is going down. It's the fact that it changes means that your productivity growth, you need more other inputs, capital and labour, to get the same level of output when that quality of the natural resource went down. And while capital lags was mentioned, which is a measurement problem, the depletion problem is a real problem. And in fact, in the study that Vernon Top did, he found that 75% of that decline in mining productivity was actually due to the depletion effect, not the capital lag effect. So I think that's quite an important thing to remember. And then when you look at environmental inputs across the board and we start demanding, well, we don't want you to pump your sewerage out and have it flush back into Sydney beaches. What we want you to do is process it to tertiary treatment. That's a lot more inputs to deal with the fact that we're not allowed to use the ocean as a great big processing centre for sewage anymore, right? So again, you get a quality improvement that doesn't show up in productivity measurements. But would we prefer to have that outcome? Well, we probably would. So our point is that sometimes we worry about productivity growth and we worry about what's happening to it over the long-term trends. But we've got to ask what's actually happening to well-being, what's actually happening to the outputs that are being delivered. Are they better? A good example is, you crack the windscreen in your car, you now ring somebody up, somebody turns up at your doorstep, replaces your windscreen, you didn't have to drive anywhere, you didn't have to wait several days, you didn't have to run the risk of driving with a broken windscreen. Doesn't appear anywhere in productivity statistics, but it's definitely an improvement in quality, right? So we might be actually doing better, and having things that are enhancing our well-being, but they're not being picked up by the measures that we're looking at. So is some of this long-term global decline in productivity actually not due to the fact that we're any less innovative, but we're getting more and more innovative at things that aren't appearing in the measures? So are we focusing more on the quality of things that we get that don't get picked up in the measures very easily? And are we focusing more on perhaps, creating a work environment that is actually better for the people within it, even though it's not then definitely driving more output, but they're more happy to work, they're more happy to, put in those longer hours. So those are the sorts of things that we need to worry about a little bit in productivity measurement, is actually to understand what it is we're measuring and how that relates to well-being. That's all I want to say.
Thanks very much, Jenny. Very thought-provoking, and perhaps when we go through the various panel speakers, we can get back to that issue about what's happening on the long-term trend versus short-term, and the quality of life issues. And Stephen mentioned the paper by Robert Gordon. That may be something that we can pick up, because I think that's that temporal issue and what is actually happening over the long term, and whether it's a general trend globally or to what extent it's specific to Australia. So,
I'll just make one quick point to follow on from a point that Jenny's made. In all from my previous job, all the climate change modelling that we do, when we show the impact of putting emissions trading in place, is effectively modelling a small negative productivity shock. I mean, that's basically what's coming out of most of those models. Of course, it's only modelling the cost of climate change mitigation action, the benefits, the things that you're trying to insure against, or the potential costs that you're trying to offset, are not reflected in that modelling. So I think it's a very good point to raise, and it is in the Gordon paper and other papers. Many of the actions we choose to take, they might be regulatory, or they may be taxation-based or whatever, are designed to address other problems that may not be being measured on the other side, and one does need to think carefully about those.
Well, that's fine. I guess the first thing I was going to say when I came up here was that I don't really know anything about productivity, but then I listened to Stephen's talk and learned a little bit, I guess. But
you know even less.
I guess the advantage of ignorance is that one can sort of take a broad perspective view, and there are certainly people in the audience who know a lot more about productivity than I do. But I think one of the things, I think Stephen's contextual introduction was really excellent. One of the things that I thought he was going to say, but that he didn't say, is that there's a real consensus among economists that the long-term well-being of society, the main driver of that is in fact productivity growth, right? Our ability to make more with less inputs means that we're better off. And we're better off in a whole variety of dimensions. We're better off because we can make more stuff in less time. That means we can use that extra time to have both more stuff and more time. I also think that to some degree the presentation of productivity potentially being a contest between workers and management, that it's about management trying to squeeze more out of workers, may be true in a very limited case in the short term, but again in the long run I don't think it's true. If you look at the massive improvement in well-being that we've seen in the last 150 years. I'm talking about really big picture. I'm talking about the invention of antibiotics. I'm talking about life expectancy that's gone from 60 years to 85 years. I'm talking about infant mortality that's gone from 1 out of 3 to almost negligible. 100 years ago we just sat in this room and we'd all know somebody who'd lost a child in childbirth. Now it's an extraordinarily rare event and a huge tragedy. All of those things come from productivity, and they all get shared for everybody in society. They might not necessarily get shared equally, but they do get shared for everybody in society. And going back to Jenny's point, and that may sound like I'm not actually contradicting Jenny at all. I think I agree with everything she said. And I think if you look at relationship between growth and human development index, for example, one of the things that's true is that the more democratic a country is, the more it's able to turn those improvements in production into improvements for life, for well-being for everybody in the society. So somewhere underpinning the importance of productivity is also a healthy functioning democracy that can then make sure those gains actually get applied to making people's lives better.
Thanks very much, Bob. For someone who doesn't know much about productivity, that was a very, a very, very helpful synthesis for us. A couple of things that I'd like to raise. There's in the environmental sphere, there's this famous equation, I put it in inverted commas, called IPAT. So that's environmental impact equals population times affluence times technology. And so it goes back to Jenny's point, and you re-emphasised it too, Bob, and also you as well, Stephen. So the idea that productivity is against the environment is actually contrary to that. There may be some short-term measurement issues, but in fact, if you want to have an issue in terms of the impact on the environment, you obviously want to address the technology side. And ultimately, if it is an input, and which it is, natural capital is an important input into lots of productive processes. So if you degrade that input over long periods of time, and that's the mining issue in the context of resource depletion, then you clearly have a problem. So addressing the productivity issue in the context of environmental inputs, I think go hand in hand on the long-term issues. So they're not trade-offs. They actually, I think, go hand in hand. So some countries that are experiencing very rapid growth, if they're degrading their natural capital stock, that will have implications for their future measured growth and gives a more favourable impression in terms of their current measured growth if you don't take those inputs into account. The second point I'd like to add to is in terms of Robin's issue, which I think is extremely important in terms of skills utilisation. There are a number of countries in the world that have actually quite, by the standards of income, have quite relatively well-educated workforces, at least large numbers of people who have university education. Egypt, for example, Nigeria, for example, yet they haven't been able to achieve the levels of economic growth and income that we would have expected given those skill sets that they have. There may be a variety of reasons and very specific reasons for particular countries, but one thing that I think that does stand out is the level of income distribution and how income distribution within an economy has implications for skills utilisation. So that may be something that's worth to talking about. Yeah. But all of us here have now had our few minutes worth of giving our sense of what's important in terms of productivity. I think I'd very much welcome you, the audience, to participate. So if I may ask, if you put your hand up, tell us who you are, your name. If you're affiliated with a particular place, then please give us the affiliation. You may be independent, in which case you don't need to give us your affiliation. So if we'll just go through that, what I'll do is I'll look for hands up. I already see one hand up, and as we go through, I'll do an order, and then I'll come back after we've gone through a few questions. I'll maybe come back to the panel and maybe stimulate some further discussion directly from the panel in addition to the questions. So I'll open it up now. I see a question from Michael in the front, and if you just tell us who you are.
Yeah, thanks, Michael Harris from ABARES in DAF. And I asked a question of yesterday morning's panel and got sort of blank stares from most of the panellists, but the things I asked about actually came up yesterday afternoon and came up today, which is really about the kind of limits, if you like, to productivity growth, or the headwinds that we face. And I'm sorry, Stephen, for coming in late. I had a lunch appointment, but I gather you mentioned the Robert Gordon story. And so yesterday what I raised was partly this issue, and you hear about it in the United States, is where I first heard about it, and then it was raised yesterday afternoon, which was this idea that we're putting people in large numbers into the education system, into the tertiary education system, and there are questions then of is this really raising aggregate productivity, and is it really being can we also rely on it as a kind of equalising force? You raise people's human capital, you raise the returns, their wage, their income, and so on, in aggregate by raising productivity. So that's one problem. And in the US, what we're seeing is apparently, the story goes, lots and lots of people in the university system incurring lots and lots of debt, but their job prospects and their wage premiums and the potential security they get from that is quite low. So that is partly a skills utilisation thing. Are we running up against barriers there, and are there other ways we should be doing that? And the second one is the Gordon one. Are we facing potential challenges in the R&D scientific technology kind of space? So your standard story is to improve productivity, human capital, invest in that, R&D, invest in that. And are we bumping our heads against both of those walls?
Can I just respond? From the Australian context, all the evidence is that higher education still gives you a very positive return on investment from an individual point of view and a societal view as well. Now, in other countries, we're seeing different phenomena happen, whether it's because we're unique and doing economically quite well, but at the moment, there's no argument that people who have got higher level qualifications earn more, and in terms of the participation argument, any post-school qualification improves significantly your chances of participating in the labour market. There's also all sorts of issues. We have a very gender-segregated labour market. So, for example, if you're a young man, you've really got a choice in terms of getting an economic return from doing an apprenticeship in something like electrical or doing a university degree. If you're a young woman and if you want to be a hairdresser, great, but it's not going to give you an economic return. And that might be one of the reasons why we're seeing university dominated by women, because they might be making perfectly rational economic choices. In terms of the skills that we need in the economy, my organisation didn't come up with 3% because we think it's a good thing. It's based on scenarios about industry structure and industry demand. So it's not we don't think skills are necessarily a good thing per se, but it's driven totally by what we think, how industry will grow, how the occupational structure will grow, and from working out that occupational structure you can work out the qualification stockpile. And we think that needs to accumulate a 3% per annum increase till 2025, which are big numbers. But currently in the Australian population, we have 13 million post-school qualifications. Now, they're only held by 7 million people, because most people hold more than one qualification. And it's likely with changes to the economy, most people will hold even more qualifications in the future because of lifelong learning, changing career prospects and everything like that. So our argument is the increase in qualifications is driven by industry demand, not necessarily, obviously there's consumer demand as well, but it is an industry demand argument. The other thing I often imagine was, and maybe this is a bit of an unfair point, if we were sitting here 50 years ago, would we say we're in danger of having too many people completing secondary education, which is now universal? And are we really going to move, and possibly this is a good thing, which is not necessarily connected to industry demand, where tertiary education will become as universal as secondary education? I mean, many people would argue that's a very good thing. We're not arguing that in our strategy. We're arguing the increase in skills is coming from our projections or our models of different scenarios of industry demand. And we actually think, and Michael Keating and our board's done a lot of work on this, the impact on productivity will be positive, but the impact from increased participation, if we achieve 69%, will be even more positive as well.
Jenny wants to do a follow-up.
A couple of things I'd like to add to that. Keynes, I think, once said that he didn't know what was going to happen when it only took 15% of the resources in the economy to produce everything we needed to eat and sleep and, all of that sort of stuff, and the rest of it was going to be services, right? So when you think about services, one, we don't measure the quality of services very well, but what is education all about? Largely it's about increasing the quality of those services, particularly the services, whether it's design elements, so it's creativity side of things, or whether it's just enhanced outcomes. So we think of, childcare is a great example. The government has mandated that childcare workers now will have Cert 3. Why? Because they think that improves the quality of the childcare service. They think it improves the outcomes for the children in the childcare service. So if we take that attitude, that's not going to come through particularly easily in productivity measures. One, because we struggle to measure non-market services anyway, but two, again, we can't measure often those changes in quality, and yet the education component is absolutely crucial to those changes. So I think in terms of how it comes through, perhaps there's a longer run issue that we haven't really looked at, and the time dimension on some of these things came up a little bit. But if you have better educated kids, then over time, what's that going to do for productivity growth as well as the well-being, more directly? And so there might be some long lags in some of these things. And the same way we got this huge sort of boost from the 50s through to the 70s in productivity growth via technology, kind of driven, we might find that some of these quality factors will be the things that come through and push more sustained productivity growth in the longer term. But it's quite a long way down the line. And on your other question of, is it an equalising factor? Absolutely. Yeah.
Thanks, Jenny. So I'll follow up with the second question that you asked there, Michael, to pass it to Stephen.
Yeah, and this is one
Yeah.
I actually started to talk about. I think when I was first preparing this, I was thinking, what should be the focus from the national interest discussion? And to be honest, I thought, worrying about the big movements in the global frontier is kind of interesting and fun, but really we should focus on these issues that are being talked about here, about how to get closer, and whether, for example, there's been studies in the past that will suggest, as Jenny's was talking about, that as we've steadily improved the education of our population, we'll catch up a bit further to the US, or at least that was the thought in the past, because on average they were more highly educated. But the more I thought about it, to be honest, and after I read Rob Gordon's paper, I did think some of the issues that Bob raised are important, because generally, it appears, not an area I know a lot about, but sustained growth has been very helpful in keeping many societies stable, in redistributing the increase pie, if you like. And I, to be honest, haven't got much to contribute to that discussion today, but it's definitely a discussion worth thinking about, that, because it hasn't always been the way through human history. In a world of reasonably well-off countries, where even the prospects for income growth were lower, what are the implications for the way society organises itself and how it stays stable? And maybe that just cycles back to this question of how the gains are distributed. And clearly the gains have been distributed very differently in the US compared to what they've been distributed in Australia.
Yeah, this is a particularly Australian panel compared to some of the others that we've had.
Yeah.
Well, our American friends have moved on, I think, from this morning and yesterday.
So one thing that's true in the US, though, is that during, from 1990 until 2005 or 6, the rate of inflation of university education was really, really high, right? Now, it may well be that the returns to education we saw booming returns to education, right, from the 80s onward. Now, those returns to education might start going down, and they might not be in the 10-12% the way they were, and maybe there has to be an adjustment of market forces. So this could be some short-term disequilibrium where people who are coming out now are not getting those high returns to education, but they are paying for all that inflation, right? So to what degree will the American education market adjust to that, I guess, is another way you could ask that question. But I wouldn't advise any young person to not get a university education. And I guess at the end of the day, that's just my gut feeling and intuition, as well as what I see in the data. So,
I was just going to say demand and supply maybe work, because in the US, the rate of people getting university education is dropping quite significantly. Yeah. So it could be because they're responding to the rewards potentially being lower.
Yeah, well, the British University Group, Millennium Plus, has just done, I suppose it shows the difference between Australia and Britain at the moment, has just done a study of what the lost cohort from their higher education will mean in terms of the economy, because applications went down by 9%. So, and they worked out how many £1 billion that was going to cost them. But obviously it was universities arguing that this shouldn't have happened. But one of the things that they were talking about was the spillover effects. And they produced a study which actually said, if you're in a workforce where you've got trained people, it's positive for the untrained people as well. Now, it's partly because it lifts the productivity, and partly because there's some diffusion of the knowledge that the trained person's got. So it was, it was a really interesting study in that sense.
Well, I mean, just to follow up on that skill utilisation, I mean, there's always the anecdotal story of the PhD person who's driving a taxi, and that is simply an example of someone who's qualified in a particular area but not utilising those skills where they've been trained. So there's a notion in economics that people will provide signals. So the education provides a signal. It's not a view that I ascribe to, but there's a view out there. So that's not just education for the particular self-actualization and for the job that you particularly want to get, but it's a signal to get into a particular, to get the job, so to speak.
There's some more work being done on that. Yeah. Steve knows the department's very interested in this as well. But Kostas Mavromaras, the National Institute of Labour Studies, has done quite a lot of work on skills mismatch. I mean, the only thing, and they sometimes argue that there's 20% skills mismatch and you can be scarred if you're in a mismatched occupation. But it also points out that some of the studies we have to treat with some caution, because it sort of masks ability, and there's not a perfect match because ability is something that you can't necessarily observe. And some of the classifications are a bit odd because, you know, retail's deemed to be a non-graduate occupation. So if you're running David Jones, you're overqualified if you've got an MBA by that sort of measure. So you have to be sort of, you know, careful in terms of how that works out. But certainly it's a phenomenon we need to observe.
Question at the back. And if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand and I'll spot you and I'll put you on the list.
Dorte Eklund, I head up the Major Cities Unit in the Department of Infrastructure and Transport. We're very interested in the spatial distribution of productivity, and I guess the pattern is being observed that high-value jobs are concentrated in some parts of our cities, and other parts of our cities there aren't many jobs, or if they do exist, they're quite low-value jobs. Yesterday we talked about inequality. And I guess there's the concern that as we move forward, we need to maximise the use of human capital, and some parts of our cities may not be contributing the human capital that exists there. I'm just wondering whether panel members would like to make a comment on that.
I'll let the panel talk, but you're raising a very important issue, the importance of cities, agglomeration, externalities. And Marshall was writing about that back in the 19th century. So it's clearly it's a pretty big issue, not just for Australia but globally. Why do people go to cities? What are the payoffs in terms of those exchanges? And as you point out, there's certain hotspots, and how you bring that about. There is a notion that you can somehow create these hotspots or provide a better environment to allow them to grow. But certainly the hotspots that I can think of, off the top of my head, have happened in a natural way. Although there has certainly been some key developments that have stimulated them, in particular Silicon Valley. But anyway, I'll leave the panel to respond to that question. Anyone who wants to?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, because even though we've got low unemployment, the highest unemployment in most cities is in the outer metropolitan areas. Even areas of Perth have got 8 or 9% unemployment, and you've got Campbelltown and you've got North Adelaide and all those issues. And I haven't got any answers, but in a sense, besides all the JSA and the things that people do, but there's some sort of interesting phenomena. I mean, the other day I talked to a restaurateur in Pittwater who said if a cook walked into his restaurant, he'd hire them whether he got a vacancy or not, because he was so short of skilled labour. And you say, but 20 k's away in Mount Druitt, you've got youth unemployment of 30%, shouldn't you run a bus? And I think there's an interesting phenomenon. It gets into a very controversial area. A guy called Chris Warhurst at Sydney University has got the whole concept of aesthetic labour. And it's saying for certain restaurants, you're hired on your look and your attitude, not necessarily on your skills. And, the whole question of, what employers are looking for, and it becomes, very personal. And I suppose, if you're in Mount Druitt in Sydney, which is a very big Tongan community, I mean, it's also about the social capital people have got, the fact that only 20% of jobs are ever advertised. So if you haven't got the social capital of the network, you might not get the job. And there was a recent study in the UK that looked at kids coming from private and public schools going to elite universities. And the kids from the state schools actually did better academically at the elite universities than kids coming from the private schools, but they got worse jobs because the private school gave them a social capital in terms of a network that they couldn't get elsewhere. So very controversial area. It's something that we're quite interested in, but I haven't got an answer.
Really, really difficult area, actually. Wish we knew the answer. We've been having a look at disadvantage, and one of the difficulties is actually really trying to understand with disadvantaged areas what's going on and what that neighbourhood effect is. And there's not really a good database to sort of get to the bottom of it. And one of the things we don't really know is whether people, when they're successful, move out of those depressed areas, or whether you're born in it, you stay in it, and you never leave it. And so, if you're getting the concentration of high unemployment and the like because the successful stories are moving out, and if there's a decent churn through and people aren't getting trapped, then it's less of a concern than if people are trapped in there because of the lack of opportunities. So it's a very difficult policy issue, and I think one that governments probably need to pay a lot more attention to.
I guess my first reaction is I think it points out, so when I think about policies about productivity, one set of policies is kind of the government getting out of the way. So anything the government's doing that stops the natural formation of these centers or makes it difficult, then it's probably a bad thing. So if the presence of stamp duty is stopping people from moving and adjusting, then we should get rid of stamp duty if you want a particular pet policy. And then government, of course, has to do positive policy. And if you think about, again, policies for productivity, I think we're in a world where the policies for productivity are both risky and expensive. So if I think about education, education's expensive, right? We've got an educational system that kind of suits 70 or 80%, doesn't suit very well the bottom 20% of the distribution. We're probably going to have to spend a lot of money to improve education for those people. Infrastructure is similar, right? We've already got a very built-up infrastructure, so making changes to it is expensive, and making changes to it is risky. Right? If we see some spot that looks like a hot spot and we start investing in infrastructure and then it suddenly moves, so I think some of the policies are hard, right? I think they need vision, and I think they need boldness.
The only issue I'd raise, and I'm sure you know much more about it than me, is how heavily government-controlled land use is. I mean, it's just replete with regulations, as I understand it, around local government and state government, and the federal government's also involved. So you sort of have to be careful. There's no, market forces aren't ripping their way through the way cities are being designed, or the way some of those developments are unfolding. And there's got to be things to do there that are sensible. I've sometimes wondered, even around product market competition, putting to one side this issue of disadvantage around, for example, the retail sector in Australia, or those types of things, whether the sort of desire to do good and to have great planning, which clearly we may well need, severely retards the potential for competition to emerge in the retail sector. So I think it's a really, this is a really hard nut to crack. I mean, town planners, as I understand it, are not paid that well, and make a set of decisions that drive how we will enjoy a city for tens of years. It's an interesting and from my point of view, heavily underinvested area in thinking about productivity and how people just interact, if you like.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I'd emphasise transportation as well, because although if you're working a 7.5, 8 hour regular day, improving your transportation doesn't necessarily increase the hours you could work necessarily. But if it takes you an hour and a half to get into work and you're frustrated and you're tired by the time you get there, then obviously it'll affect your ability to perform in the workplace, as well as reducing your leisure time. So transportation is a key issue in the United States. Others will have more expertise on that, but parts of the United States, there really is no, certain cities, transportation out of particular locales to other locales. You mentioned about the bus, Robin, to where the jobs were in Sydney, but that's another set of issues about and transportation in terms of public transportation. There are certainly issues there from our local government side as well as the planning side, which I think are fundamental. Most of us live in cities, so to the extent that we have cities that provide for us in terms of our welfare as well as making us productive, I think that's critical to the sorts of things that we do. So yeah, good point. Thank you.
Greg Dival from Climate Change and Energy Efficiency. I want to bring in another little angle to this, and that's the energy efficiency angle. Productivity gains through using less energy and achieving the same outcome. So energy productivity itself, for me, is quite an area for right policy development. And I'm just interested in the panel's views on that. And I know Stephen has some experience in this, but I'm just interested in others' views. Is this an area which has benefits not just for productivity, but obviously for climate change as well? And is it one of the areas that we really should be paying a little bit more attention to?
Okay.
Oh, you always ask yourself the question, if there's dollar bills lying on the sidewalk, why aren't people picking them up? So if these companies have, you know, sort of good energy saving opportunities that are actually a net benefit, why wouldn't they adopt them? Now, is there a bit of regulation preventing them adopting it, in which case get out of the way? Or is it that there's a capital cost to adopting it and they're uncertain about future price paths for energy and the like, then think about trying to get more certainty into what's likely to happen in the future price paths so they can make sensible investment decisions. But government come along in mandating your energy efficiency or mandating your water use or mandating this, that and the other thing is probably not going to contribute a heck of a lot to productivity growth.
Well, Greg, you know my views, and they're not miles away from those views. I mean, it's always worth looking at where people aren't making the rational decision you might expect them not to make, but generally one would see be advising government to enter areas like that very cautiously for the reasons that Jenny outlined.
Okay. Please. The mic's coming. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the panel. Give us a lot of good ideas. But I still...
Excuse me, could you tell us your name? And
oh, sorry.
Okay, that's okay.
Dr. Yunting Lee from DIVA.
Thank you.
I think something maybe we are still missing. For example, previous question raised some question related to productivity, but from people London. My question is follow the same logic. So you have talked about a lot of things related to productivity. Something missing in my mind is, say, organizational change, organizational innovation. So far we have talked not much. Maybe some people touched a little bit, but for me, I think not enough. Probably I think this is another important area we need to, for the policy makers need to pay attention.
Okay.
Yeah, and say, for example, we did some, in DIVA we did some empirical work. We have found, say, the coverage rate of ARA, AWA and CA has important thing to do with productivity growth. So this gives us some indication. Organizational change, organizational innovation is important. This is a little bigger question. I throw to you. And one smaller question, particularly I'm asking, Robin. I was asked to do some work to calculate economic cost of skill shortage. But I look at all your information in your website, etc., but I could not find any hint. Maybe you can give me some idea.
Yeah,
thank you.
Well, certainly calculating the benefits of increased productivity and increased labour force participation. I don't think we've necessarily quantified all the skill shortages. Maybe that's a job we've got to do. I mean, there are, as you know, obviously coming from DIVA, there's difference between skill gaps, skill shortages, and most firms' number one strategy to skill shortages is not to recruit people, but to increase the hours of their existing workforce. So, I mean, I think there's a number of problematics that we need to do in terms of the cost. I'm sure that the macro level there has been estimates in terms of what the cost of skill shortages actually are to the economy, and certainly I've seen some estimates for individual industries about the cost of skill shortages as well. So, you know, we'll try and dig some of the data out for you and put it on our website as well in terms of that. I mean, I agree with you in terms of like organisational arrangements. I mean, to just expand the point, when I talked about, you know, organisational design and job design in terms of, you know, facilitating skills or utilisation and learning organisations, I once was talking to an airline and we were talking about organisational design, and I won't say which airline it was, but they gave me the hard luck story that all airlines are high volume, low profit businesses, so they couldn't afford to have organisational design experts on their staff, so therefore they contracted out organisational design. And the argument was that most of the organisational design expertise in Australia was in a few large companies like banks and lots of large consultancy firms. Now, you know, whether that's totally true or not, but this was an organisation that realised the importance of organisational design, yet contracted it out and didn't see it as part of the absolute core. So it was an interesting take on how, you know, firms view it. But that might be a perfectly legitimate business strategy for that firm to take. And, you know, does government have a role in dictating business strategy at that level, which is an interesting question I think we're all grappling with.
I might wrap your question up back with the previous one. I mean, in that Dolman Gruen paper that I mentioned, they report a study by Bloom, I can't remember the co-authors, which looks at the potential for productivity in the manufacturing sector in Australia to lift if Australia had the average management practices of the US. And they suggest quite a large number that, you know, the productivity level of manufacturing in Australia could lift if on average our management practices in manufacturing averaged that of the US. And to kind of wind back to Greg's earlier point about regulation and energy efficiency, I mean, what would be if you think there's a set of not especially smart management decisions going on in companies and they're not picking up the $20 bills Jenny talked about, maybe the best answer isn't to go and regulate them to pick up the $20 bills, but to think about the things that improve the skills and that drive better management practices is the way more to come at that policy. Now, that wouldn't be to say, for example, if you looked at energy efficiency in households and you noticed that many energy appliances were purchased in a distressed nature because you only buy them when they broke, that you might not think about regulation in that environment because it's not the kind of standard way in which you make decisions. So I think you have to think, you know, and that's what people talk about when it comes to hot water systems, for example. So I think you have to think carefully about, you know, which hammer I suppose you're using to crack these nuts, and I think you do have to think carefully about this organisational management stuff, because I suspect going and trying to regulate people to improve the way they make decisions is unlikely to work.
I would say the commissioners, they put the burners on them by making sure they're facing competition and actually having to do it.
Yeah.
I just want to make a quick point though, that we have actually maybe not explicitly talked about organisational capital or organisational investments, but in that intangibles that Stephen mentioned, a large chunk of that is the investment in better organisation, management structures, you know, that kind of thing. And if you actually add organisational capital to the other kind of intangible capital, Paula Barnes did the Commission study, I think it was about 2008, and she found that if you actually looked at the growth of physical capital, that rate of growth had actually slowed quite significantly. But if you added intangible capital, the rate of growth of intangible capital had kind of offset that. So the share of capital had actually not been declining the way it might have appeared if you just looked at physical capital. So it's a really quite interesting study. And it points to the fact that if we don't measure it in productivity, a lot of that productivity number that we get, that we measure as a residual, is things like organisational capital, better managerial structures and things like that. And so to the extent to which Australian firms aren't doing that as well as they did in the past, or not doing it as well as they could, productivity growth is lower. But we've got to ask ourselves then, as Stephen has mentioned, what's the appropriate policy response to get firms to do better, if that is an area in which we're lagging.
Okay, question, Matt.
Thanks, Martin Hoffman, Deputy Secretary at Grant. I just wanted to... thanks, Olivia. Just wanted to continue the discussion on regulation or energy efficiency or energy productivity regulation. And while definitely having overall sympathy with the perspective put from the panel, I guess I just challenge slightly that it's a somewhat pro forma response in terms of the standard anti-regulation perspective. I think we've seen, although I can't give the citations, studies that show that industry has consistently overestimated the costs of compliance with environmental regulation prior to its imposition. Some classic studies about the US Clean Air Act and Clean Water Acts through that period. When you talk about exposing them to competition, a form of competition can be the need to comply with a regulation. And so we've seen the advances in the fuel efficiency of cars and significant technological advances being made through a long-run, known and certain glide path of increasing fuel efficiency standards, particularly in California and in Europe, that has led to significant technological improvement in the car industry, energy efficiency, reduced particulates, etc., etc. So I think, I would be the last person to extrapolate from that to a general sort of pro-regulation approach to the economy in general. But I think this question about the strategic use of regulation to enhance technological innovation is a slightly more complex and interesting one than the panel may have given it credit for. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want me to go? Or?
Yeah, you can go.
Look, Martin, I mostly agree with what you said. I've seen those studies, and Stephen Chu, the former Secretary of Energy in the US, obviously has talked a lot about this. But in part, given the US's particular approach to addressing climate change issues, leads them down that track, and so certainly people compete about regulations. And it is also true to say that we have to be careful about always implying that such things impose additional costs. There have been examples when the costs of doing things that are energy efficient aren't actually more, even in terms of their capital costs. They lead to this innovation. So I certainly think you have to be careful and nuanced around your understanding, but one always has to keep in back of mind the broader resource allocation issue that's going to go on across the economy when you get into this game. And but I take it's a point well taken.
Jen?
I think actually it's a very good point, but you've got to ask the question of what is the regulation actually providing that wasn't being provided in the marketplace? Is it because we don't put a price on carbon? Is it because even if we put a price on carbon, it's so uncertain about what that future price is going to be because it's all policy dependent and the like? So we're not getting the signals that we get in the marketplace. So we're looking to give them another set of signals that have some stability and allow planning and sensible decision making. So I think that's kind of the issue, is what is the regulation replacing? So where's the market failure and what is the regulation doing to address that market failure? In some cases, it's providing a sensible pathway forward. But I've got to make a comment on the cost of regulation, because it is interesting. We did a study last year or the year before on identifying and evaluating the costs of regulatory reform. And it was kind of interesting, or the benefits of regulatory reform, looking at all those standard costing models of all the grand savings we were going to get when we removed all the red tape. And the Dutch have had red tape targets forever, and when you talk to businesses, they're sort of saying, can't see it. They're claiming we've saved billions and billions of euros, but businesses can't see it. And so I suspect sometimes, and when we've gone looking for these things, once businesses have adjusted, they've forgotten there's a cost involved and they've moved on. And so that's a big issue. And so sometimes it's quite difficult to kind of actually get a good measure of what the actual costs are in some of these cases.
Okay. There's a question in the front, I believe, first. And, yeah.
with regards to productivity are management and leadership, human capital, sustainability, and innovation and technology. So definitely a lot of things that have been coming up in this forum as well. I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with the chamber, but just by way of background. Sorry, just by way of background, our members are each of the state chambers of commerce and industry around the country, and also 28 industry associations, collectively representing about 350,000 businesses across Australia, employing 4 million people. So quite a sizable organisation in terms of representing the voice of business in Australia. And one of the first tasks I've been doing is going out and meeting with each of our members and finding out what they're doing in relation to productivity, what the challenges are, and how my project can assist them with what they're trying to achieve. And definitely training and more education is something that's coming through really strongly. A lot of our members are running training courses on management and leadership, on financial management skills, on project management skills, all of these capabilities that business people need that they're not necessarily developing through normal education channels. The other comment I'd like to make as well is just with regard to sustainability. As an industry association, I'm not going to argue for more regulation, but certainly working closely with business to understand what the issues are, making sure that the impacts are taken into account and coming up with smarter ways to achieve whatever it is that is being targeted. With regard to the question around why aren't businesses putting in place these energy efficiency savings, if there is just the $20 bills there, why aren't they picking them up? I think one of the big challenges with business, and this probably gets overlooked quite a bit, is there is just always so much going on when you are running a company. So you tend to be focused on the most important big ticket items. I also have a manufacturing business that I'm an equity owner in, so I can speak a little bit in terms of actual business on the ground as well. And sometimes you sort of need that incentive to look at what's possible with energy efficiency in order to feel it's worth making the investment of time and money to investigate and then implement the solutions. It may not necessarily be that it's a huge financial investment, but just having the incentive, I guess, to take the time to actually find that out is sometimes a bit of a challenge when you're stuck with everything else that needs to go on in terms of running a business.
Thanks for the comments. Do you have a question for the panel? Or? No.
I guess if anyone on the panel would like to comment on those 4 categories that I'm proposing to look at under my project in terms of productivity, that would be good to hear. So they were management and leadership, human capital, technology and innovation, and sustainability.
Bob, we haven't heard from you. Do you want to comment?
Those are all good things to have on the list.
Okay. I think there was a question, and yes.
Carla Holmberg, can you hear that? Yeah. I work in the Office of the Coordinator General for Remote Indigenous Services. I'm a senior advisor there, and I previously worked in Treasury, so I knew of you when I worked in Treasury. So what I wanted to ask about was to bring it back to the challenges to productivity and specifically human capital investment, because particularly in remote Indigenous Australia, it seems to me that that's kind of an untapped area for returns to education, return on investment. And I'm wondering, and I know it's very complex and difficult, but whether any of you have done any research or looking into how we might improve productivity, and particularly, I suppose, individual, labour productivity in remote Indigenous Australia.
Could I? Well, I can give you an example from personal experience. I used to run a TAFE Institute, and we had a very large Aboriginal community. And the big problem is when I said that human capital investment or training is a necessary but not a sufficient condition. One of the big problems that we had, and I can think there was a town on the Queensland border called Boggabilla, and the community there had done Certificate 2 in arts and cultural practices for the last 10 years. Now, most of the rules in TAFE were you can only do the course twice. In this case, people have done it every year, and the decision was, do you take that course away and the community hasn't got a lot more to do? And really the course was occupational therapy rather than education and training. And we were very lucky. We had a very inspired teacher who recognised this as an issue, and actually, instead of doing Aboriginal arts and cultural practices, taught the group paper making, and from that came a paper making business of bespoke paper making, and the teacher basically we employed as the works manager. Now, so there was a bit of government intervention, there was a bit of subsidy to actually establish the business, which became the Uraba Paper Company. But I think it sort of illustrates the point that if you keep on giving people, you know, course after course after course, and there's no other economic drivers in there, you've still got some actually, you know, you've got some other necessary things that you need to do to make the education and training work. In that case, as I said, it was an inspired individual who decided to take and actually form a company. And all those people are now employed, and the community's got capital in the company as well. So that's just a personal anecdote of what you need to do. I suppose it's the same question as that we sometimes blithely say, that maybe we need to take the jobs to the people. Now, fortunately, Australia, because of the resources boom, you can't say 20 years ago, regional Australia often had higher levels of unemployment. You know, places like Orange don't now, but you know, you get examples of when I was in Port Macquarie, we trained everybody to be a call centre operator because, you know, a hard economic rationalist would say the North Coast is an example of market failure because the population's only growing because we've got a social security system. But we were trying to prepare the people to have a pool of skilled people there so a firm would actually move there, and Centrelink did.
Stephen, did you want to...
Look, I'll just add, I mean, I think you're clearly dealing with a very set of complex issues, but it did make me think, to be honest, you don't always really want to look, I think, through some of these policy issues through the product, necessarily through the productivity debate. Ross Gittins wrote a nice piece a couple of weeks ago where he pointed out that lots of people like to hang, this is the reverse of what you're trying to do, probably not so useful policies on so-called claims to what they're going to do for productivity, all kinds of support and various other things. I suspect the motivation and the outcomes you try and achieve in your policy area don't particularly need a strong productivity lens, as people like to say these days, to be put through them to motivate them. They're motivated by a much broader range of issues around disadvantage.
I'd just like to make the point that one thing that got touched on very, very briefly, and I think is a really important point, is that the institutional framework within which markets and firms operate actually really matters for productivity. And in particular, to take Stephen's analogy of, you know, there's sort of two ways you get productivity growth. One is about getting to the frontier, and the other is pushing the frontier out. Well, the rate at which the frontier moves out, you know, varies obviously for different firms in different industries and different countries. But this getting to that frontier, and the one thing we know is that poor institutional arrangements, poor governance arrangements, you just look around the world with the countries, you know, in Africa that are struggling, it's that lack of a sound underpinning institutional framework to support firms, private property rights, a number of things, or a replacement for private property rights if that doesn't culturally sit. You've got to find some other way of creating an institutional structure on which production can actually be based. And that's a major challenge. So looking at Pacific nations, they've got, again, different, you know, Western institutional structures don't necessarily align with the cultural and traditional practices. And so you've got to find a different institutional frame on which, you know, economic activity can actually hold. And that's quite a challenge.
Question in the middle, and then there's down front.
Colin Lyons is my name, from the Department of Industry. Stephen made a comment in passing in response to Dorde's question about some of the big issues in the outer metropolitan areas of cities, and it occurs to me that a lot of our manufacturers based near the centre of cities struggle to maintain and attract appropriate employment because the people that they need as employees can't afford to live in areas reasonably close to where those employment centres are. And turnover is directly related to things such as travel time, and a lot of people, and absenteeism also is positively correlated with that. And I think it's worth mentioning that in Germany, one of the reasons cited recently in a documentary was that many of its successful employers and companies are located in smaller cities with low turnover, high morale, and retention costs are much less than they are in other Western countries. And so it occurs to me that maybe the Productivity Commission might like to look at the question of trying to limit the rate of growth of our big cities where much of our industry is located, because that would help in trying to make the case of improving productivity a little bit easier.
Well, the Commission, well, we do have a supporting research program, so we do have some scope to initiate our own research. Largely we respond when the government asks us, and so if you can organise your minister to organise our minister to send us a reference, then we'll probably look at it. It's an interesting question, actually. But I think the interesting thing for Australia, though, is just thinking about what an urbanised society are and the dominance of major cities. It's not so much other cities, it's about how do you create within our very large cities areas that can attract, you know, to the outer. Why isn't the outer? I mean, Parramatta is a city, quite frankly. You know, so is Blacktown. So why aren't they becoming? What are they lacking? Is it the transport infrastructure, so manufacturers won't go there because they can't connect? Is it local planning rules? And we know we did a study on local planning rules, and believe me, they're pretty challenging. So what are the things that are getting in the way of, you know, the manufacturers moving to where the labour actually can afford to live? Because it makes sense, as you point out, it's perfectly logical. But it's not necessarily always another city somewhere else. It's within these very large cities are lots of other, you know, centres of economic activity. And I think to some degree that happens quite a lot in the US. And I think there was a study, Ron Haskins did a study, it was like something like, you know, 70% of people lived within 20 kilometres of where they worked. You know, quite agglomeration was happening over there, but that's not so much happening here. So why we haven't got to the bottom of. So good thing to look at.
Thank you. Any follow-up from the rest of the panel? Okay, question over there.
Well, based on the last question and this question, we might need cities. Because my question relates to technology, the way it's advancing today, brings into question the need to come to work. There's a lot of conversation about teleworking and so forth. But when you look at the jobs that are actually in the cities today, a vast number of those jobs don't need to be done in a building. They could be done just as easily at home with the right technology. And that has implications for, I'd be interested in the panel's views on that, the impact of that on productivity and also well-being. And I'm looking really more 10, 20 and 30 years forward, because that's really what the planning cycle has to be for our cities.
And you are, sir?
Oh, sorry, Robert Charles with the Australian Taxation Office, large employer. We're in a lot of cities. But it's a more.
I think we've heard of you. I get regular correspondence. Anyone from the panel? It's important.
I get up every day and I come into the office if I want to, and I don't come into the office if I don't want to, and I make that choice completely based on my productivity and well-being. So, boy, it works for me to have flexible work arrangements. I mean, my response is completely personal and subjective, but I mean, clearly the new technology gives us a lot of possibilities, but also. Is it Yahoo in the US who recently now is requiring their employees to come in, whereas they didn't before? I think people who've gone the full way towards telecommuting realize suddenly that there's also a culture that you have to form amongst people who work. So clearly, I think we're going to move to hybrids that look like that. But I think it does give us. I think it gives us a possibility to improve both productivity and well-being if it's done correctly.
I think there are real possibilities. I'll just add something here as well. That why do we have meetings in the first place? In the context, why do we have face-to-face meetings when we can have email, or we can have a telephone, or even write letters? Dare I say? Well, clearly because the quality of the communication differs, and certain pieces of information have to be communicated in different ways. And certainly the face-to-face is clearly important to how we do business, so to speak, and affects productivity. So to what extent certain activities can be done, the communication can be decentralized, so to speak, and what extent that it needs to be face-to-face, I think is a fundamental issue. And it's not clear to me that just because we've got the technology that we'll end up all at home working via the internet in some form or other. So I can add some more to that, but I think Robin needs.
No, I was just going to say that we had a conference on the future of work, which looked at teleworking, but also looked, if you believe Linda Grattan, The Shift, which is a fairly optimistic view of the world, in 30 years' time we'll all be working at home and we'll be buying and selling things on basically giant eBay systems around the world, so there'll be no global boundaries. But I do think that human behaviour needs to be studied. I can only give you an anecdote. When I used to run a TAFE institute in Australia, we'd actually quite liked our teachers to turn up a bit more, because you could effectively do a 4-day week, which was fine, but we wouldn't mind them being in 5 days. When I ran a college of further and higher education in London, we wanted all the staff to hot desk because property was so expensive at the time. We couldn't afford to give everybody a desk and everybody an office. And Westminster City Council, for example, only had sufficient office spaces for people to come to work 3 days a week. And they expected everybody to work from home 2 days a week. And another company in London said you can have a 1% pay rise if you keep your offices, but you can have a 5% pay rise if you hot desk, because we can save on costs. We weren't very successful at my college in London because people actually wanted to come in 5 days a week, because the argument was they'd bought their season ticket and they didn't want to heat their houses at home, whereas they could have free heating if they came into work. So, I just thought, oh God, it was a totally reverse problem I had the other side of the world. So I think human behaviour's got a lot to do with this, and human interaction will have some way it dictates.
Well, I think we're getting close to tea time, I think, but... Oh, okay, thank you. Sorry, I couldn't see you at the back. Yes.
Dennis Waters.
Yep.
I'll preface my comments with the fact that 75, I think I did some productivity analysis in the dairy industry, or the dairy sector. And my comment is picking up on, I think it's Jenny's point, that productivity is a residual. And then we've got Quentin's work the other day that he showed us. If you did some tweaking with the data, you changed what productivity numbers came out. If we get better analysis of our capital, we discover that there's more capital input. And so I'm wondering whether the issue is that we're chasing a bit of a chimera when we devote all of this conversation to productivity, and pick up partly the point that's been made about these things happen in the workplace, and Lisa Paul made that point yesterday. When you get down to the micro level at the workplace, you're actually talking about the incentives to the owner of the business, and so there's profit and his return. You're talking about people come to work for that person, and so you're talking about my income and my returns, and that there's a whole bunch of my intangibles as to why I want to work in a particular place. If I get that built into my input mix and so on, productivity disappears to zero, and we are focusing the discussion at something that, well, as I say, it's a residual, but what does it mean when, if you look at those micro things, you find that, as a colleague down the front said, she's the owner of a manufacturing company. Well, I was a farmer, and when the bulls got out, your first job, your priority was to go and find the bulls and get them back in their bullpen, because you didn't want them mixing with the cows and the heifers now, because you didn't need that sort of stress at the wrong calving at the wrong time of the year. So I'd like the panel's view as to why we, and back in 75, everybody who left the Industries Assistance Commission and went to the OECD said to the people, we should do a study on international comparisons on productivity. I'm just wondering why Australia has this burning desire to spend a lot of resources in analysing productivity, which is a residual, and there's not a lot of information going into studying stuff at the grassroots level.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of questions there which I'm sure the panel can respond to, but in terms of, there was multi-factor productivity in terms of after you accounted for labour and capital, what's left over in terms of any output growth, which I think is an important question, and it's a puzzle, and it's a measurement issue, but it's certainly not, I don't think it's not an issue that we should ignore in the context that we talked about knowledge, we talked about innovation. There's a whole range of issues there that go beyond just capital and labour. But sure, if we could measure it all and know precisely what it all accounts for, and then we would know where it's coming from, and then we could say, well, if we tweak this lever, we could get this going up, and therefore we're going to. Well, yeah, we don't. I don't think we'll ever be in that situation. We can do some quality adjustments on the input side and add more inputs if required, but I still think that issue of explaining, which I think is essentially what the symposium is about in some sense, this session, is explaining productivity. So you have to measure it to get some sense of what's going on, but you have to explain it. And then the explanation is what do we do about it, why do we care about it, and what we need to do about it. And I think that, to me, is a fundamental issue, but I probably said enough. So I'll pass this over to Jenny first and anyone else on the panel.
Very briefly. I think why we want to look at that residual. We want to explain more of that residual, because if we can explain it, we can understand what's changing and what's driving it, right? So we can understand that if we pull a policy lever, is that likely to change? So the depletion effect, if we hadn't looked at, the mining productivity numbers and said, well, you can explain this much with labour, you can explain this much with growth in capital, but capital we know has got a problem because we count it when we invest and it takes some years to come online. And then we still got a gap once we've explained that. What else is going on? Well, let's have a look at the natural resource base. What data have we got? What information have we got about, and there was the people doing that study did an exhaustive trawl for data to try and find what information there was out there on the quality of the resource deposits in Australia. And there was quite good information on oil and gas, which showed very clearly that there was a depletion effect there. The coal, there was okay information on, and a lot of that was about the level of overburden that had to be removed and how easy it was to extract. On some, there was information about the quality of the ore bodies being mined, and then the information kind of ran out, and some of the really good information is no longer being recorded, so you couldn't replicate the studies even if you wanted to. So what we're trying to sort of say is, what don't we know? Mm-hmm. So you're looking at trying to understand, well, we can say this is accountable for that. That's not going that well. We know this responds to policy in this way. Participation rates, for example, labour supply. We know there's some policies that work there. Capital, well, what's going on in the investment side is, is the financial markets distorted? Is there right incentive to invest the right amount of capital? What else is going on? Well, we've got the natural resource side. What's going on that side? Sometimes we put regulations in place to insist on a decent quality of, minimum pollution. Now, we may say, well, that's costing productivity, but it's worth it because we really value that reduction in pollution. So we're making some trade-offs there. So this is all about informing policy. It's all about doing an analysis that helps us understand what is making our economy tick, what is actually making, the sort of the well-being of the economy and the people in it tick as well, so that we can try and design better policies for that outcome.
Nicely put, Jenny. Any additional comments?
I would just say it's not only an Australian obsession. I think all the OECD countries are worried about productivity. And when you list the things that you talked about, I think it reveals why, aside from the broad brush policies that Jenny's talking about, it's an area in which we probably don't want to design a lot of policy, right? We do kind of want to leave it up to individual people to make the best decisions. I mean, I think it's one of the, as an economist, I think one of the hallmarks of being an economist is, not micromanaging people's behavior, right? I'm not interested in walking around behind people and tapping them on the shoulder every 5 minutes and saying, oh, you should do this instead, that would be more productive, right? But if the incentives are aligned, then we have a lot of information that tells us that people will maximize productivity and maximize their profit, right?
And even high management consultants should tap them on the shoulder and tell them what to do.
Exactly, you can outsource it.
That's right. So look, I think we've really explored a lot of issues, and I've been fascinated by the questions and the discussion we've had. But so there will be an afternoon tea, I believe, is there? They're available in the main foyer. But before we leave, I do want you to thank the panel, but not just yet. I just wanted each of the panel members to if they have one last thought to leave with us, and we'll go in the opposite direction than we started out. So I'll start off with Bob. And if you haven't got a last thought, but we are an election year in 2013, so if you could pass on one piece of advice to our political leaders, what would you suggest in terms of productivity?
My one piece of advice is that politicians hand-wringing and saying, gee whiz, wouldn't it be better if everybody was more productive, is not going to be useful at all. And that productivity sometimes can be hard.
Okay. Thanks, Bob.
Well,
and don't feel obliged to answer the question if you don't wish. You can answer a different question.
I'll just pick up very briefly on the issues that Jenny was going to. I mean, there is a sense in which I mentioned Ross Gittins' article that people will not get obsessed, but get all het up or focused. Productivity is in part an organising principle to think about growth, or just to think about how effectively the economy is operating, and I think that's the really useful part of these productivity analyses. Is just to think about the trade-offs that are going on and whether they are efficient.
Good. Thank you, Stephen.
Well, I'll put in a brief advertisement. Shiji, who's here, is at the Productivity Commission, is we're going to put out something called the Productivity Monitor, which is going to try and hopefully, as an annual publication, just kind of keep this productivity debate going. Good. So it's not a sort of the industry's put out first good step trying to demystify, and I guess this will be continued attempts to demystify. And so I'll leave it as the advertisement.
Sounds like a good initiative.
Yeah, finally, just a practical point. Stephen talked about it, about the importance of leadership and management. I'll totally endorse that. But if we could not forget one of the most important aspects of leadership and management is first-line supervision, what we used to call 4 men and 4 women. And I think they have a critical impact and role to play in the whole productivity innovation debate.
Thanks very much, Robin. So can we put our hands together for the panel?